Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. I am very excited about the guest joining us today. He's kind of a spirit animal of this movement that we are a part of. I consider him a guy who's blazed the trail for independence everywhere, especially in the media, and a guy whose path I've crossed many times but haven't really gotten to have a substantive discussion. So I can't think of a better time to welcome finally to independent Americans the great and powerful Michael Smerconish is here. Welcome, sir.
Animal spirit is a compliment. I like it the way you've used it. So that's great. I've just never been referred to that way before.
Well, we could also call this conversation two bald white guys with beards who are independents in media who used to back up Chris Cuomo. I don't know.
That's true. It's a small club.
It is. You know, I went back to try to figure out when we met. And the earliest record I could find was 2006 when you were hosting Scarborough Country.
Oh, my God. Okay. All right.
And you had me on with Ilario Pantano. We were talking about Iraq. It was a long time ago.
Ilario Pantano. What a name from the past. And the Scarborough show, I need to remember the role that I played in that show because, Paul, I am so often the sixth man on the court. I mean, you reference Cuomo. I'm very proud to have guest hosted for Chris at 9 p.m. I remind people that there was a 5-year time period, wait until you hear this, where I guest hosted Hardball for Chris Matthews. And at the same time, Bill O'Reilly's Radio Factor. In that same era, I guest hosted for Glenn Beck when he was at Headline News before he went to Fox and got all dark. But also, I mean, I really cut my teeth guest hosting for Scarborough on Scarborough Country when that show was on at 10 o'clock at night from Secaucus. And then they would drive me back to Philly and I was doing morning drive in Philadelphia and I would get up by 3 o'clock in the morning, hopefully having slept for 2 hours in the back of the car. But I need to remember that I did that work for Scarborough too. It's funny the way it all looks in retrospect.
Well, you're like a solid relief pitcher that needs to get in a regular starting rotation. I feel like, no offense, but you've been a backup for everybody across the board for so long. I'm glad you've got your own show and your own platforms.
Well,
but you got a unique perspective recently,
too. And I got the call, and they said, will you do 9 o'clock for a couple of weeks? A buddy of mine who's very media savvy, he said, look, you're good. And you're safe. Don't make too much of it. You're good and you're safe. They need you to hold down the fort and not get in trouble.
Can I ask you, how hard is that to do when you are, a political independent? And I want to dig that apart. I want to get into Ukraine. I'd love to get into the latest on Trump and Biden, everything going on. But I'm really fascinated about your unique viewpoint because we talk so much on this show, and this company is built around independents, unaffiliateds, which I believe are the most important and powerful force in American politics right now. But you have been on all sides, and you've often. Does it feel like it's hard to wear other people's clothes? Because that's what it's like when you're in someone else's show, right? You've got their branding, their production crew, and for me, in the small times I've done it, I feel like I'm kind of wearing somebody else's clothes. What is that like, Michael?
It is so true. It is such a great observation. Let me just go back to where I was a moment ago. When I would guest host for O'Reilly's Radio Factor, oftentimes on the same day, I would be guest hosting for Matthews on Hardball. And it stands to reason because they would vacation, close to Christmas and then maybe in August. And that's when I would get the call. And I couldn't mention Matthews' name in Fox News and literally couldn't mention. They didn't want to hear any reference made to MSNBC. And then I'd go to MSNBC like 2 hours later and it's like O'Reilly never even existed. And the cultures were so significantly different. And yes, I mean, very well-intentioned people would have the show ready in terms of guests that they wanted me to put on air or notes that they might want to share with me, but with that other host, the permanent host in mind. So it doesn't matter whether it was O'Reilly or Matthews or Scarborough or Cuomo more recently, the group I'm working with are used to somebody else. And there are always challenges in that. I went through it in a very amiable way just a month ago at CNN because they would say, well, they have a habit of booking for that 9 p.m. show. Truly, it's like nothing to have 10 people booked.
Right.
for that program. And I would get off my radio air and I'd say, geez, I'm not so sure about going in that direction. And they rolled with it in a way that I found admirable. But to answer your question, it's tough. It's tough. Hold me accountable for when you see me on my own CNN program or hosting my own Sirius XM program, because that is me doing what I want to do, booking the guests that I'm interested in and saying the things that I believe.
Well, I think we've talked, at least on my show, a lot about how the polarization in politics is destroying our country, and I think it's a national security risk. It's so essential to understanding this moment we're in. But I don't think the media is explored enough for its partisanship and the lack of support for truly independent voices who still have an opinion. You're independent, but you're not neutral. You have opinions. You take stands on things. There's a difference between that. But I read up in preparation of our conversation, and there was a moment where you left the Republican Party. You went out as an independent, and the question was, are you throwing your career away? Right? Can you succeed as an independent in media? And it's happening now, Michael, in a backdrop where you've got a Joe Rogan, who is arguably independent in maybe a negative way or a positive way, depending upon how you look at it. But there is a new media landscape where you can create Smerconish.com, you can bounce from different spots, but your audience can follow you in a way maybe they couldn't 5 or 10 years ago. So can you talk about this moment in the media, and how hard is it to be an independent in the media?
Well, it was extremely difficult then, because what happened in my case is that the dream of everybody who works in a market, a big market especially, is like, hey, if I can hold down Morning Drive in Philadelphia, I know I can do a syndicated program nationwide. After all, I'm guest hosting for O'Reilly in 500 markets on the Radio Factor. I want that gig. And just when that dream came true and I was being put into national syndication, now we're at the 2008 presidential election. And Paul, I had voted only for Republicans at the very top of the ticket from 1980 through 2008. But I became disenchanted with the way in which I thought the Bush administration had taken their eye off the ball and going for bin Laden, Zawahiri, and those responsible for 9/11. It's a whole story unto its own, but that really was the break point for me to decide it's Obama for whom I'll vote. Now the question is, I'm going to go in there and close that curtain. Am I going to tell this to my audience? I don't have to. Not going to help me if I do, but I decided that I kind of owed it to the audience to say, this is why I'm voting for Barack Obama. I'm not telling you who to vote for, but this is what I'm doing. And there was a huge blowback, and it was perilous to my career at the time. I mean, those radio stations where I was being picked up, I was surrounded by Limbaugh and a stable of his lesser known imitators. And I stuck out like a sore thumb. I remember, and I'll name the station, it was WOR in New York. It meant a great deal to me to have a footprint in New York City. And the word came back from the station ownership about how upset they were when I changed in 2010 my registration to independent. And the email, which I saved somewhere, says, if this behavior continues, we're going to cut loose his show. I mean, such was the level of disgust. We can't have an independent on our flagship in New York City. We've got all these conservatives. Brutally difficult. I hope that I'm showing in a small way that you don't have to be doctrinaire and read talking points from the left or the right. There's a market out there for you, for me, and for people who, frankly, the bulk of the country. 42%, according to Gallup, are I's. They're not R's. They're not D's. They need to be served as well, and nobody's doing it.
Well, that's why I've been so eager to have. I wore my Independent American shirt. For the folks who are watching on video, you can see I've got the I shirt on. I'll get one for you, Michael, after we wrap. But there is this moment in America where more and more Americans are choosing none of the above. The people who are leaving the Republican Party, especially right now, is a high number. But also, I think underreported and underappreciated is the number of young people who are not joining a party, right? You're kind of an older generation of Republicans, usually moderate, usually strong on national defense, maybe socially liberal, who leave the Republican Party. You've got some folks that have left the Democratic Party because they felt Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders were too far left. There's a lot of politically homeless people. But this new generation, I think, is really the one that's exciting, because you're of a generation where you wore, one jersey and you switched your jersey. And then you've got folks like Andrew Yang who wore another jersey and are now switching. But what about the people coming up who never picked a jersey? There's this new generation of Americans that consider themselves independent and unaffiliated. But what is your insight into who independents and unaffiliateds are in America right now?
So it's interesting that you raised that, because my wife and I have 4 children, a daughter who is in her early 30s, and then 3 sons who are in their early to mid 20s. They didn't have the benefit that I had of growing up in a Republican Party where you could look to, here's my prototypical solid Republican: George Herbert Walker Bush, Papa Bush, Bush 41, class act, dedicated his life to public service. Given the way that he was raised, could have gone in a different direction and never had to worry about, taking care of other people, because he had a very privileged background, but instead goes totally, game on to help others and to serve. But today, if you were to ask the 20-somethings to identify Republicans, like, who are you getting? You're going to get these fringe types that now dominate the media. And that's all they know. And I think that's what's driven them away from the Republican Party, and to an extent away from the Democratic Party as well, because the people who get all the attention are the bomb throwers, the verbal bomb throwers, those who succeed in social media and can fundraise from it, but they don't accomplish squat. I mean, the path, I say this all the time, Paul, on my own program, is the path to get ahead today in Washington is no longer to get elected, establish seniority, choice committee assignment, and pass something. Now you better be nimble with your fingers in 140 characters, and you'll be able to raise a shitload of money if you can get a lot of people's attention.
So when you think about that, Michael, and we take it to the actual structure of our political system, we've talked a lot about open primaries and ranked choice voting, which I think is key to fundamentally redesigning this, because George Washington famously warned us against the dangers of parties. But now we've devolved into this bifurcated system where it's mutually assured annihilation on an almost daily basis. But when you look at the political system, I want to ask you 2 questions. First, what do you think are the structural changes that need to happen in order to allow space for independence to be viable? We see places like Maine and Alaska where it seems to be a better environment. But then also, who are those spirit animals? I say it's not Andrew Yang. It's not Howard Schultz. There are a lot of folks who kind of self-appoint themselves as king of the independents, and they assess the problem correctly, but their solution is often themselves. We had Adam Kinzinger on this show a couple episodes ago. I think he does represent a lot of potential for those people who are political jump balls. So, Michael, what do you think needs to change structurally? And then who are the rising stars that independents can look to or root for?
Okay, so I didn't fully answer your last question. There's one lingering thought that I want to offer, and it's this, because you wanted to know, like, really who is this group we're talking about. In the most recent Gallup survey, they initially asked, are you an I, a D, or an R? And 42% said, I am an I, I'm an independent. And this part I don't like. Gallup then pushed them and said, yeah, okay, but which way do you lean? And then the story came out, and the story said, the year began better for Democrats than it ended, because here's what the party affiliation is between the R's and the D's. And I don't even remember the final number. It doesn't even matter to me. I was pissed that they had discounted the plurality who said, I'm an independent. And it's as if they didn't even exist. Okay, so I'm sure Gallup would say, well, a lot of people who claim they're independent like the panache of thinking that they are independent, when in fact they're more an R or a D. That may apply to a lot of folks, but not to all 42% of us. I like that you acknowledged that I have lots of views. I have views on everything. They just don't line up neatly into an ideological box at one end of the spectrum or the other. And Paul, the people that I meet, and maybe it's a function of my social circle or where I travel or where I speak, but I meet people for whom the issues are a mixed bag. They're conservative usually on fiscal issues, much more liberal or progressive on the social issues. Now, the answer to your question about structural change, there are a lot of structural changes that need to get made. I endorse your whole platform. Of course, we need open primaries. I like ranked choice voting. Campaign finance reform is something that we need to do so that people know who are spending for all these commercials where they have some disclaimer at the end that we can't even follow. Gerrymandering is a huge issue, but so too is self-sorting. There's something going on in this country now where those who can afford to are making geographical decisions and housing decisions to be with the like-minded, and we're being raised in these sort of parallel universes now. All those things are important. But at the top of my list, and I delivered a speech at the Reagan Library in September on exactly this, you've got to change the channel. The title of my speech was, "It's time to change the channel." We've never had as much media choice available to us as we do today, and yet so few of us are exercising it. Instead, we're siloed into this media landscape at the far left or the far right. I don't know about you. I don't go to bed at night without checking out the 9 p.m. slot at CNN, seeing what Rachel Maddow has to say, seeing what Hannity says. I want to hear and see all of it so that I'm getting a balanced perspective, and then I'll make up my own mind. Now, look, that's what I do for a living. I realize other people don't have the time, but we got to get people to realize the dangerous impact of polarized media and get away from it and be open to more perspectives.
Yeah, we are definitely kindred spirits in that regard. And you know, when I started, you know, Righteous, we looked at creating independent content for independent Americans and looking at the new media model, because that, you know, presented more opportunity and lower costs and access to audience, and they can find us in a way that you know, wasn't possible 10 years ago. But, you know, there's also a casting that goes on in the traditional media companies. And I'll say it. I mean, I don't think there are a lot of places that are looking to give, you know, older white guys shows right now, right? I mean, you got MSNBC, for example, that's going all in on the Democratic Party. They're hiring Simone Sanders. They're giving her a show. They're not even trying to look distant from the Democratic Party, you know. And then you got Jesse Waters on the other side. I do want to press you to come up with people you think are actually political leaders who I think that's the X factor
I'll
too,
answer
Michael.
your question,
right?
but
Yeah,
let me just
the leaders that, if I can hold on, if I can, Michael. The question I want to ask too is, in that environment, you got Joe Rogan.
Right.
And Joe Rogan's doing 20 million or so, like 20 times what CNN is getting. I don't know what the metrics are, but he's doing a massive audience that is maybe an audience that used to go to Imus or used to go to Stern or used to go to Limbaugh in the early days. So can you talk about him specifically? Because he is a media force. He's a juggernaut, and he's got a real impact on our political landscape now.
So I'm familiar with Rogan's product because of my sons. I mean, Joe Rogan's a big story now. You and I are having this conversation at a time when Neil Young is saying to Spotify, either I go or Joe Rogan. You can't get much bigger than, you know, being in a battle with Neil Young, at least in my view. But before the Spotify deal and before he was a household name, I got turned on to Joe Rogan because of my sons, my 20-something sons. And frankly, it was a lot of the UFO stuff. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy from Area 51.
Oh, yeah. Rogan built a great name on UFOs and UFC.
Yeah.
Like that, you know, UFOs and UFC were like Rogan's bread and butter for a long time. And that was a good base, right? If you're a politician, that's two good bases right there.
No doubt. I can remember 20 years ago, the head of UFC, before he got big, the hell is the guy that I'm thinking
Dana
of?
White. Another bald, outspoken guy. Yeah.
Okay. And Dana was my studio guest in Los Angeles, and we got along well. And I remember him saying to me later tonight, I'm going to one of those comedy outlets on Sunset to watch a comedian named Joe Rogan. You know, come check it out. And left me tickets, and I went over, and I'm watching Rogan, and here's Dana White, and I'm just thinking, like, look at the way their careers, you know, grew from that particular moment. So I think that he's a gifted broadcaster. If you're asking me to assess the skill set and explain the success of Joe Rogan, he's smart, he's a good communicator, and the subject matter for me is hit and miss, because I'll scroll through those podcasts often, and there's a lot of stuff, Paul, it's just not in my wheelhouse, and I won't take time to listen. But I think that he has tapped into a disaffected audience of young people who weren't getting what they're looking for from the cable outlets and a lot of the other conventional media.
Yeah, we've talked about it a lot on this show. I mean, he's the middle finger to the man. Yeah. Right. And that's been always a part of American independence. Right. And I think independent too often is being defined by others rather than the people who consider themselves it. It's almost, in a blanket way, conservative used to be a lot of different things to a lot of people. And now, some people consider themselves very progressive and independent. Other people consider themselves right of center and independent. So I think it's kind of a malleable thing, but it's also not a monolith. I spent so much time in the veteran space. I used to say veterans are not a monolith. Well, independents are not a monolith either. But who do we look to by default, right? Since there is no, I saw a post you had about Colin Powell, who was a, icon and a transformative leader for so many folks, especially in the military. If Colin Powell had gone independent, that might have been, a viable third-party independent party, right? There are other people like that. We had Admiral Mike Mullen on this show. Who are the politicians that can, beyond the structure? This is what I think is missing, Michael, is the magic, right? Like who is going to be the magic candidate? Who's the first one to break the seal? And then if that person can also get a Mike Bloomberg or someone else to provide the funding, then we got some horses that are viable, right? So who are those horses that you see that might be viable?
Well, first thing I want to say with regard to how you just characterized the independent movement, I just want to add, by definition, it's hard to put a single face or demographic or definition because we're independent. We're not that and we're not this. So we're everything else that they don't represent. You referenced Mike Bloomberg. He would have been at the top of my list. Notwithstanding what happened to him in the debate at the hands of Elizabeth Warren, I was really bummed and also disappointed because I think that Bloomberg is such a smart guy that he had to have really done the legwork to investigate whether he'd have had a shot as an independent and must have concluded that he didn't, or that the risk was just too great that he would have elected Donald Trump, which was the last thing that he reelected Donald Trump, which is the last thing that he wanted to do. But if Michael Bloomberg had taken a shot at president as an independent, and Paul, when he opened a Philadelphia headquarters, it was on a Saturday morning. I got off my CNN show. I went and stood in the crowd just to be a part of what was going on. The funny thing was I was embarrassed because when it all ended and he came by and shook my hand, he had not a clue who I was or why I might be there. And I was trying to lobby for an interview. But Bloomberg would be that kind of a guy. Schwarzenegger, notwithstanding the whole naturalized citizen issue and the presidency, I mean, Arnold fits that bill. I have tremendous respect for anybody who steps out of and is willing to oppose the people who we think brought him to the dance. Manchin and Sinema get high marks from me. I wish that the Senate had other unpredictable people in it instead of individuals that you knew how they're going to vote on legislation based on whether it was introduced by an R or a D. So like that's the type of person that I'm looking for.
Well, so I have major issues with Sinema and Manchin. I mean, in so many ways, but without going too far down that wormhole, I don't know if they represent independence as much as they represent, flies in the ointment right now for Democrats, and maybe that's enough to be something different. But one specific, what do you think about Kinzinger? Kinzinger came on this program, said, he said if Trump's the nominee, I will leave the Republican Party. Which may be the breaking point for others. But what do you think about Kinzinger's viability if you've got a Biden versus Trump matchup?
First of all, I like Adam Kinzinger very much. I did one of the Sunday shows and remember him from the green room and from watching him in that closed space. And then, of course, what's happened to his career thereafter. He couldn't win. I hate to say that. I'd be much more comfortable with Adam Kinzinger than others. And I would have to think through from where is he pulling those votes? If his idea is, I'll be the sacrificial lamb, I'll be the spoiler, I'll go take down Donald Trump, are there people who are going to vote for him because they couldn't stomach voting for Kamala Harris? Like, I don't know. I have to think through and look at some data as to which way that cuts. I don't think that it helps Trump, but I don't know that it would cause the harm to Trump that could determine the outcome of the election.
Yeah, that's I think the challenge for us as independents is to show that candidates can be more than a spoiler, and I think that really starts at the local elections and at the state level, where there's still tremendous opportunity and more favorable electoral conditions in some ways. So
well, Paul, can I also add?
Please.
You got to get on the debate stage.
Yeah,
that whole Commission on Presidential Debate, 15%. The way you get to 15% is when people see you on a debate stage. If you can't get on the debate stage, I don't know how you got there. Look, this also got me in trouble. I voted for Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, and I was public about it. I probably would have reversed that ticket and had Weld at the top and Johnson in second position, but that was the way that I voted in the 2016 election. And honest to God, to read some of my hate mail, you would think that it all came down to my vote, and I'm the one that caused Donald Trump to be elected and for Hillary to lose. But I'm looking for that kind of independence.
But you were voting in Pennsylvania. Your vote, I assume, your vote mattered. You weren't like me, writing in Ray Kelly for mayor in New York City.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a realization too, Michael, that a lot of the independent candidates suck as candidates.
True.
Like Michael Bloomberg, for all his accolades, and I wish he was mayor for life in New York City, was a terrible retail politician, right? Gary Johnson was awful. I mean, especially after the Syria comments. I mean, I got blistered because we hosted the Commander-in-Chief Forum with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and IAVA hosted it with NBC, and we got attacked, we got sued because Gary Johnson wasn't in. That wasn't our decision. That was Donald Trump's decision, and that was Hillary Clinton's decision. They basically said, if Gary Johnson comes, we're not coming. And that was what was happening in a lot of these backroom discussions that I don't think Gary Johnson supporters and libertarian supporters understood. The media people didn't always have a vote because the other candidates just wouldn't share the stage with them. So I think that pressure's got to be there too. Michael, I hope you can stick around for a couple of extra questions, fun ones for our Patreon members, which help us pay the bills. But before we get to that, how does this impact Biden now? Like, I think he's losing independents left and right. I think he's lost a ton over Afghanistan. I think the Democrats have underestimated how many they've lost over COVID. As a guy who's got a kindergartner and a preschooler, I'm sick of the ridiculous mask nonsense. I'm in New York where we have a mandate, we don't have a mandate, and it seems really inconsistent. And I think one of the Democrats' Achilles heels is always execution. Being able to execute these big dreams they've got, whether it's Afghanistan or the pandemic. So can you talk to how fucked is Biden with independence right now, in your view?
Well, I think I think it's the NBC survey. I read so much of this data, and I know you do too, and I don't have it in front of me, but something within the last 48 hours speaks to the erosion of independence, as you just articulated. Clearly, that's where he's being hurt the most. It's not that there's been such movement among Republicans. There's been some movement from Democrats, but it's the very people you and I are talking about and trying to reach who have abandoned him. Here would be my take. I don't think that his strength, I don't think that his popularity or support, a better word, was ever all that strong to begin with in any of these groups, including Democrats. The reality is he was elected not because people were voting for Joe Biden, but because people were voting against Donald Trump. In the end, it was a referendum on Trump, and I don't know that it would have mattered all that much whoever the Democratic candidate was against Trump. And I think that Biden is suffering now because of yes, the situation in Ukraine and the situation with COVID and inflation at a 40-year high and on and on and on. But interestingly, the lack of Trump's social media access, I think, is a detriment to Biden, because Biden needs Trump out there for a split screen in order to drive his numbers. The best thing for Joe Biden, the networks are all turning their back on Trump rallies. He was just in Arizona, and he's going to have another one this weekend, and you're going to have to really hunt to find it.
Right.
But the best thing for Joe Biden would be if they'd all televise it. People would be like, holy shit, what's Biden up to? Maybe it's not so bad. So I think he's harmed by the lack of a comparison, and also because the perception of, I think him having, I hate to even say it, but having lost a step, his age, and just the lack of being able to think and act on the margin. I think it's all of these factors that are catching up with him.
I think that's right. The best thing that can happen for Biden's reelection campaign right now is for Trump to declare he's running.
True.
Because then the media has to cover him, and then you've got that contrast on a regular basis, especially with regard to integrity and Biden being a person of character and honesty and honor, even, right? And then you've got this other factor, which I really think people are underestimating. War with Ukraine could save the Biden presidency, or it could doom it. I mean, this is already so complicated and has so many moving parts, and in my view, is national security is often off the radar in this country, right?
Right.
Until it's front and center, and that is dangerous in times where our domestic security is threatened both outside and from within. So in the same way, I think people are underestimating the threat of the January 6th ripple effects. Ukraine. This is the real deal. I mean, we just ended a 20-year war. We might be about to start another one. So do you have a sense for national security specifically, how it could alter things even in the midterms?
Well, I do. I don't know. I don't know how Biden turns it around. I hope he doesn't turn it around because there's an international incident, some type of a national crisis brought on by events between Russia and Ukraine. But I don't see anything legislatively that turns it around. He's not getting
Nothing.
Build Back Better through. I frankly, I don't, one of the issues that maybe there's some ground is trying to button up the manipulation of the electoral college tabulation. I would like to think that R's and D's could agree on that and they would get that done. But I don't see big opportunity for legislative achievement between now and the midterms. I just don't think Mitch McConnell is going to allow him to get anything done, and reconciliation is only going to provide so much. So if he's not going to turn it around legislatively, wherein lies the opportunity? Is it responding to a crisis? We've got a number of them right now, and they're not going well. If there is something untoward that happens with Ukraine, is he going to provide the leadership? I have my doubts. Look, what dogs him today is the worst thing a politician can face, which is a perception of weakness.
Yep.
That's where he's at. That's I think the common denominator of all of these things. So hope it doesn't come to that, but that could be an opportunity.
Well, it feels like that, and the biggest variable is their health, right? Like people say to me, who are the nominees? I say it's going to be Biden or Trump unless one of them dies.
Well, I say it's
that's
gonna be,
how I see it right now.
I don't believe Biden. There's no way. There's just no way that Joe Biden runs for re-election, in my opinion. And I say three things about Trump. It's his nomination, if he wants it, as long as he's healthy, solvent, and unindicted.
Yep. Well, in the meantime, we are going to be watching your program. I urge everyone to listen to you on SiriusXM, the place I used to hang out once in a while. Watch you on CNN. Subscribe to your newsletter. You've
Please.
also got about 10 books you've written. You're everywhere. But I really want to thank you for being a conscience, for being a voice of reason, for taking the hard road. One that I'm sure you've made great sacrifices to take, but it's been to the betterment of the country, and we need your voice now more than ever. And this community
kind.
especially celebrates and appreciates you. Thank you, Michael, for all that you do.
Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. Look, it's a much easier road doing what you and I do or are seeking to do if you are one of the doctrinaire types. There's a natural audience, and guess what? It's a hell of a lot less work. All you have to do is rely on the talking points that people are hearing from every host who preceded you and will follow you.
Well, I'll lead block for you anytime or follow your lead, as long as we're not rooting for the Eagles. But thank you, my friend, and stay vigilant.
Thank you.